brief reading today is Luke 19, 1 to 10. Jesus and Zacchaeus. So Jesus went into Jericho and was passing through. There was a chief tax collector there named Zacchaeus who was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but he was a little man. I can relate to that. And he could not see Jesus because of the crowd. So he ran ahead of the crowd and climbed a sycamore tree to see Jesus, who was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to that place, he looked up to see Zacchaeus. "Hurry down, Zacchaeus, because I must stay in your house today." Zacchaeus hurried down and welcomed him with great joy. All the people who saw it started grumbling. "This man has gone as a guest to the house of a sinner." Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Listen, sir, I will give half of my belongings to the poor, and if I have cheated anyone, I will pay back 4 times as much." Jesus said to him, "Salvation has come to this house today, for this man also is a descendant of Abraham. The Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thanks, Liana. You say Zacchaeus. I've grown up saying Zacchaeus, and I'm not sure which is right, so I could be wrong. And I'm not worried about that, and you won't. You know as well as I do who we're talking about, the small man who went up a tree. Have we ever thought to ourselves, I am good at making money, but there's still something missing in my life? No. I know some people in the life of the congregation who would definitely say no. Have we ever realised that we are somehow trapped in an unhealthy lifestyle? Have we ever felt that we didn't belong? Have we ever faced the painful truth that we are very much on our own? If so, the story of Zacchaeus is for us, because his encounter with Jesus was a life-transforming one. And in the Bible, it reads almost like a children's story. It lends itself to telling, and there's thousands of pictures online of Zacchaeus up a tree. And we may remember some of the details of the story. We don't get a whole lot in the story, but we know that Zacchaeus is the chief tax collector in the major town of Jericho on the trade route from Jerusalem to the countries east of the Jordan, and on a trade route going up and down the Jordan Valley. He's a rich man, but small in build. And Jesus is passing through Jericho, one of the oldest cities in the world, according to archaeologists. And Zacchaeus wants to see Jesus for who he is. That's what the text says. I want to see who this man is. I heard about him, I want to see him. Because of the crowd, he climbs a tree so he can see him. And Jesus calls him down out of the tree because he wants to spend some time with him in his home. It says, I want to remain with you, I want to stay with you. In our popular language, we would think that means stay overnight, but I think it means spending a significant amount of time with you. I want to give you some real time. And everyone who sees what is happening grumbles, I think that's brilliant, grumbles about Jesus' choice to be the guest of a sinner. Now, we've never grumbled at that sort of treatment, have we? When others get special treatment, we miss out. We should have got it. Well, then we're amazed. For some reason, Zacchaeus declares a dramatic change of lifestyle, promising to give half his possessions to the poor and then to repay anyone he cheated 4 times back what he cheated them. Have we ever heard of such a financial turnaround? I haven't. It's an incredible story. And Jesus celebrates his decision. He says, today salvation has come to this house, because he too, he must have been saying it to the grumblers, he too is a child of Abraham. He belongs to the people of faith, the people of God. For the Son of Man, which is the term Jesus used to refer to himself, the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. And that's about the full detail of the story. And so we're left with questions eating away at us. At least I was when I read this passage probably years ago. Surely a businessman like Zacchaeus wouldn't make such a major financial decision after a few hours with Jesus. What's the power of Jesus that can lead to such a huge change of heart on Zacchaeus' part? So I need to give some context to the story. Jericho was a large commercial centre 25 kilometres to the east of Jerusalem, but way below sea level. Jerusalem's up on a mount, not terribly high I don't think, but Jericho down in the Jordan Valley, not far from the Dead Sea. You can see it there. Can you work out the names? It says Jericho OT and Jericho NT. Old Testament Jericho and New Testament Jericho. They were in different places. Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho on the Old Testament one. Jesus met Zacchaeus in the New Testament one, and Bartimaeus. Jericho was known as the city of palm trees because of its cultivation of date palms. There's a bunch of dates on a tree. It was known for its lucrative production and export of balsam, the most expensive perfume plant in the ancient world. Balsam was also used as a medicine. I think, is there a balm in Gilead? There's also a reference to balsam. King Herod had his winter palace in Jericho. And perhaps I just imagine that blind Bartimaeus, the beggar, might have gone to Jericho because it was a rich town. And hopefully when he begged, there'd be some people who had plenty of cash to spare. Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector. So he must have eyed the wealth around Jericho and rubbed his hands with glee. I'm going to do well here. And as a chief tax collector, he would have employed other tax collectors under him, all of them receiving taxes on the goods that were transported in and out of the city, apart from other taxes that were collected as well. Now, I'm not sure if this information I'm going to give you next applies to exactly the day of Jesus, but it certainly applies in the time of the Roman Empire and gives you, again, some context. Businessmen would participate in open auctions conducted by the Roman Senate in Rome. They would compete for the right to collect taxes in a certain city or region. And for each place, the Senate would give a quota to be raised by the tax collectors. Any money they raised over the quota was theirs. And so you can see there was plenty of room in this system for corruption and for exploitation. And so it was to their advantage to inflate the value of a person's goods so they could get a higher amount of money when they set their proportions for taxes. And when people couldn't pay the tax collectors would give them loans at high rates of interest and so continue to make more money. The Jews hated paying taxes to the Romans, the occupying power. And if there was any hint that taxes would be increased, that was enough for the Jews to rise up in rebellion. I wish my dad had known all this, because my dad was an income tax investigator before he retired back in the 1980s. The Jews hated these Jewish tax collectors who sold out their souls to the Romans for the sake of making money. So they did all they could to make them societal outcasts. Tax collectors were disqualified from being witnesses in court. They didn't trust them. They were excommunicated from synagogues. They were not allowed to change money at the temple and get the temple money so they could buy the the animals or birds to sacrifice at the temple, so they couldn't participate in making sacrifices to God. And the Jewish religious leaders even made it acceptable for a Jew to lie to a tax collector in order to avoid paying taxes. So tax collectors were treated like lepers, and they faced the death penalty at the hands of the Romans if they did not raise the required quota. So there was a risk involved in winning the auction for a particular town or region. No wonder they needed to be guarded by a Roman soldier. That slide has one soldier, I think, is it the next one? The previous one has two soldiers. But I suspect the money that Zacchaeus was making was not sufficient compensation for a life of isolation and rejection. Maybe he didn't realise how much he was isolated because he was more excited about the money. He was little more than a tool in the hands of Rome, a money-making machine. And add to that, he was an enemy among his own people, the Jews. Now read the story of Zacchaeus in the light of that background for tax collectors. I just wanted to make a little aside though. No doubt Zacchaeus lived in isolation, chronic isolation. And yesterday, Ken Jones was sharing that Noosa has a high number of people in the population, higher than other places, who suffer chronic isolation. And Ken was saying he hopes the Yarning Circle, their learning centre, might be a place where people can come who are lonely, just like men's sheds function that way. Anyway, Jesus saw Zacchaeus watching him from his perch in the sycamore tree. He called to him, "Zacchaeus, come down quickly. I must stay at your house today." I wonder when was the last time someone called Zacchaeus by name. To the Romans at best, he was a slave or servant, but not a person. He was an instrument in their plans for raising money. To the Jews, he was the enemy. So they would find lots of ugly names to call him. But to call him by his proper name would be far too familiar, too friendly. And Jesus loved Zacchaeus and wanted to spend time with him. You know, it's a special thing when Jesus calls your name. When I was one of the ministers in Cairns congregation, the congregations in Cairns in the 80s, one weekend we had a special series of seminars followed by church services with guest preachers from Praise Chapel in Townsville, Jack Fruenwald and Bruce Lindsay. Lindsay doesn't sound quite right, doesn't it? Lindley. Anyway, at the Sunday night service, we had about 100 people come along, and that was about 5 times the normal congregation. And an invitation was given for people to come forward to the communion rail to respond to Jesus after they'd preached. And Ben Morgan, a young school friend of our son's, about 9 years old, came forward, and he was asked why he came forward. He said, "I heard Jesus calling my name." A special thing when Jesus calls your name. And we listen for the names of our children and grandchildren when awards are being given out on school assemblies. It gives us a thrill to hear their names read out, even when 1,000 other names are read out as well. And then I worked with a Vietnamese congregation in Brisbane for some time, for 4 years. When I was their guest preacher in English, they'd have someone to translate. Sometimes it was the pastor or the minister translating it into Vietnamese. I would listen to his sermon but not understand their prayers in the Vietnamese language. But most times in the prayer they would include my name. In the middle of a jumble of foreign words, I'd hear Neil Sims, Reverend Neil Sims, or Muksu Neil Sims was the... Now that would come out, and they were praying for me. I would be blessed to know here people who, I worked with for a time, but they prayed for me. Jesus used his name Zacchaeus when everyone watching him called him sinner. He's gone to be a friend of sinners. You know what Zacchaeus means? Anybody know? Zacchaeus is it's on the screen. Zacchaeus, a Hebrew name meaning pure or innocent. How ironic. A cheating tax collector being pure or innocent. There was no way the Jews were going to use that name for him with this meaning when they'd experienced his harsh and exploiting treatment. But Jesus was different. He had a vision of who and what Zacchaeus might be, what he might become. And there's a sense in which maybe he was calling out his name, and Zacchaeus, you can be better than you are now. You can be pure. You can be innocent. Because names often mean something. And there's people here whose names were chosen deliberately because of the meaning of the name. Jesus was calling him, I believe, to return to his true self. A life of holiness and righteousness, freed from the self-seeking motive of making money. The grace of Jesus was very inviting, in contrast with the judgment of the crowd. And Zacchaeus, it didn't take long for him to recognize the difference. The crowd would never want to come near his house. Jesus said, I must come to stay at your place. No one had treated him like this in a long time. Zacchaeus had forgotten what it was like to have a friend who wanted to be with him. Now that's an assumption, but I think that's probably true. And so this relationship became a transforming relationship. And Zacchaeus knew almost instantly, I'm sure, that the love of people was far more precious than the love of money. And I'm convinced that the grace of Jesus, the love, the kindness, the friendship of Jesus touched the heart of Zacchaeus deeply. And he knew what mattered in life. Giving up half his money to the poor was now no big deal. He wanted to bless them in their needs. Repaying those he cheated, that was a must, because one right relationship with Jesus gave him a hunger for every relationship to be right. He'd lived with the pains of broken and exploiting relationships for too long. He'd been cut off from community by the rejection he had caused in others. He was ready to move out of his self-imposed isolation, no matter what it cost him. Jesus' grace gave him the courage to change, to escape his life of wealth and bondage. Now note that Jesus did not say, Zacchaeus, change your ways, and then I'll come and give you some time at your place. No, Jesus said, Zacchaeus, I must come and stay with you today. Zacchaeus was changed by the presence of Jesus, and once Zacchaeus decided to make Jesus welcome, then the change began. Salvation came to the home of Zacchaeus in the person of Jesus. For those of us who've given priority to making money, Jesus comes in grace to turn our lives around. For those who are trapped in an unhealthy lifestyle, Jesus comes in grace to lead us out of our bondage into the freedom of a healthy life. For those of us who feel we don't belong, Jesus comes in grace to lead us into community with like-minded people. For those of us who feel the pain of being on our own, alone, Jesus comes in grace to us that we will never be alone again, to show us that we will never be alone again. For those of us who feel pushed aside, marginalised, forgotten, for those of us who are poor or broken or our lives are in a mess, it doesn't matter what our life experience. Jesus keeps drawing us into the circle of his grace. Amen. We're going to stand, we'll sing this. At your best, take in the words, because John Bell has something to say and he says it in a fresh way. And it talks about the women who are abused, the child with no breast, the baby. Christ is the world. Christ is the world. The world belongs to Christ.